Blake Harrington. Our chief operating officer didn't wait for the room to settle. He grabbed my project binder, flipped it once like it offended him, and threw it across the conference table. It hit the floor with a flat, ugly sound. Paper slid everywhere. A few pages stopped at my shoes. Take this trash out, that was it. No explanation, no question. Just a sentence delivered the way people talk to janitors they don't bother learning the names of. There were people in the room who didn't work for us. An investor, a legal observer, someone from partner relations. I remember noticing that because Blake didn't seem to care. He liked audiences. Power landed better when it had witnesses. A quick note before the story continues. What you're hearing is a fictionalized narrative, created with the assistance of AI to explore real workplace dynamics and leadership consequences in a meaningful way. It's meant to educate and provoke reflection, not to present literal events. If this isn't the kind of content you enjoy, you're always welcome to step away, rest, and look after your health. I didn't say a word. I stood there for maybe 3 seconds, long enough to feel the heat in my neck, long enough for the silence to get uncomfortable. Then I bent down and picked up the papers. My hands were steady. That surprised me. Blake smirked, already turning back to the screen. He was the kind of leader who believed volume was vision. If you talked loud enough, people assumed you knew where you were going. I was the opposite. I built foundations, quiet work, risk maps, contingencies. No one applauded because nothing exploded when I was done. No one defended me. Someone laughed, not loudly, just enough to register, enough to sting. I stacked the pages, slid them back into the binder, and closed it carefully. Not because it mattered anymore, but because I always finished what I started. As I walked out, Blake added, "Let's move on. We don't have time for fear-based thinking." Fear-based. Right. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. But just before the door closed, I caught one thing in the corner of my eye. Ethan Wolfe, the lead institutional investor, wasn't smiling. He hadn't laughed. He was watching Blake the way surgeons watch shaky hands. He said nothing. Neither did I. And somehow, that felt louder than anything Blake had thrown. I don't know what kind of day you're having, but I hope it's treating you gently, if you can. Light a small lamp or adjust the room lighting. Give your space a calmer mood while you listen. Let me know where you're listening from. It matters more than you think. Subscribe if you want to hear what happened next, because the silence that followed was louder than the insult. They called it quiet work, the kind that never earned applause and never showed up in press releases. I learned early that if I did my job right, nothing dramatic happened. No lawsuits, no emergency calls, no executives scrambling to explain themselves on earnings calls. Silence was success. And silence, apparently, was forgettable. I fixed contract language most people never bothered to read, buried clauses, ambiguous timelines, penalties that looked harmless until someone tested them 3 times. Those fixes saved the company from litigation that would have cost millions and weeks of bad headlines. Each time, Blake Harrington nodded once, then moved on as if he'd just avoided a pothole instead of a cliff. He never said thank you. He never said my name. Whenever recognition came around, Blake made sure I was nowhere near it. Strategy decks were presented without attribution. Risk assessments were summarized by someone louder, someone easier to market. I watched my work get filtered, diluted, and finally credited to the team, which really meant Blake. In meetings, he leaned back in his chair and smiled whenever I spoke. Not the kind of smile that invites discussion, the kind that warns you you're about to be dismissed. "We need vision, not paranoia," he said once, cutting me off mid-sentence. A few people chuckled. Vision sounded heroic. Paranoia sounded weak. I didn't argue. I adjusted the numbers, tightened the models, and kept going. What none of them seemed to understand was that my job wasn't to imagine best-case futures. It was to map the worst ones and make sure we survived them. Growth was easy to celebrate. Stability was invisible. The project Blake threw on the floor wasn't a pitch. It wasn't a theory. It was a completed market risk assessment, unreleased, unsigned, and unfinished only in the sense that it hadn't been formally acknowledged. It showed exposure we hadn't priced in yet. Volatility scenarios no one wanted to hear before lunch. I had planned to walk them through it slowly, carefully, the way you tell someone bad news when you want them to stay standing. Instead, it became trash. As I left that room, binder under my arm, the frustration finally settled into something heavier than anger. It wasn't just that my work had been mocked. It was that the company had chosen ignorance over preparation, performance over responsibility, and they had done it out loud. That choice would not stay quiet for long. No matter how. What I didn't realize that morning was how little my project actually mattered once it left the room. The real story was already forming somewhere colder, quieter, and far more consequential than our conference table. It was forming in the notes of people who never raised their voices and never needed to. Ethan Wolfe didn't interrupt Blake. He didn't frown. He didn't react at all. From the outside, he looked like every other investor I'd seen, calm, neutral, detached. But I knew that type. They weren't watching slides. They were watching people. How decisions were made, how pressure was handled, how disrespect showed itself when no one thought it carried a cost, while Blake performed. Ethan observed every interruption, every joke at someone else's expense, every moment where authority replaced judgment. Blake loved to dominate a room, to prove he was in charge by taking something apart publicly. He thought confidence was volume. Investors think confidence is control. Linda Marsh sensed the shift before anyone else did. She always did, as head of investor relations. She lived in the space between perception and reality, smoothing edges before they cut. She leaned forward, voice measured, and started reframing the moment. Blake was passionate. The company encouraged debate. High standards sometimes looked uncomfortable from the outside. It was polished, professional, almost convincing, but no amount of polish changes what people see with their own eyes. Ethan's pen kept moving. He didn't look at Linda when she spoke. He didn't nod when Blake joked. He simply wrote. That was the part Blake never understood. Investors don't get emotional. They get analytical. They don't punish bad ideas. They punish unpredictable leadership. Markets can absorb losses. They don't tolerate instability at the top. By the time the meeting ended, the temperature in the room had dropped. Conversations stayed polite, but shorter. Smiles didn't last as long. Handshakes felt rehearsed. Blake walked out satisfied, convinced he'd shut down what he called unnecessary noise. I walked out knowing something else had replaced it. Later that afternoon, while my access was still active, an email crossed the executive distribution list. It was brief, no accusations, no drama, just one sentence. We're reviewing governance risk. That was it. No one replied immediately. No one needed clarification. In 4 words. The conversation had shifted from performance to consequence, from personality to structure, from opinion to exposure. I closed my laptop after reading it. Whatever happened next was already in motion, not driven by emotion or loyalty. It was driven by people who watched, remembered, and acted without raising their voices. If you're still here, you're probably as curious as I was back then. I didn't rush when I left the building. There was nothing chasing me, and nothing worth running toward yet. I walked straight to my car, placed the binder on the passenger seat, and sat there for a moment with the engine off. No anger, no shaking hands, just a strange, unsettling calm that felt heavier than panic. The market opened 30 minutes later. I wasn't watching the stock at first. Old habits told me to wait, to observe patterns instead of reacting to noise. I drove home, unlocked my door, and set the binder down on the kitchen table like it still belonged to something alive. Then my phone vibrated, once, twice, then again. By the time I opened the trading app, the line had already started to dip, not dramatically, not yet, just enough to suggest uncertainty, a hesitation, the kind that precedes movement. I felt nothing. That scared me more than the numbers. Analysts didn't mention my project. No one asked what had been thrown away. Instead, the commentary focused on tone, on leadership posture, On the optics of internal conduct during an external-facing meeting, words like erratic and unsettling appeared where forecasts used to be. I made coffee and watched the chart move while steam rose and disappeared. 5% down, then 8. Small losses that compound when confidence starts to leak. I recognized the pattern instantly. It wasn't a sell-off driven by data. It was a reaction to behavior. My phone lit up with messages I didn't answer. Colleagues asking if I was okay. One executive asking if I wanted to talk. I left them unread. There was nothing to add. The system was responding exactly as designed. An hour after I walked away, the story had rewritten itself. The rumor spreading wasn't about a flawed strategy or a risky forecast. It was about control, about a senior executive who humiliated his own team in front of outsiders, about what that said regarding judgment under pressure. The stock slid harder after that. 15%, then more. Commentators began using the word governance. That word changes everything. It signals a problem deeper than quarterly numbers. It implies a crack in the structure. I closed the app and turned the phone face down. Whatever happened next no longer depended on me. I had already done my part. The calm didn't break. It settled in. Cold and steady. As I realized the company wasn't reacting to my absence, it was reacting to what had been revealed when I left finally. If you think this is just an ordinary story, give it a few more seconds. The first call came faster than I expected. I wasn't in the room to hear it, but I knew exactly how it went. Blake Harrington laughed, a short, dismissive sound, the kind men make when they want fear to feel smaller. Someone warned him. Maybe legal, maybe investor relations, maybe both at once. It didn't matter. Blake had already decided it was noise. Markets overreact, analysts exaggerate, weak hands panic early. I'd heard those lines before, delivered with the same confident shrug. From what I was told later, he leaned back in his chair and said, "This is an overreaction." Then he smiled, satisfied, as if the word itself could flatten a falling line. Linda Marsh didn't smile. She sat across from him, hands folded tightly on the table, eyes fixed somewhere just past his shoulder. Linda was good at many things. She could calm investors, soften language, buy time. What she couldn't do was fake conviction when it was gone. And in that moment, it was gone. She tried anyway. She mentioned sentiment. She mentioned timing. She suggested a statement, something neutral, something fast. Blake waved her off. He said they shouldn't validate panic. He said leadership meant standing firm. Standing firm felt noble. Doing nothing felt powerful. That was Blake's mistake. He confused inaction with strength. The second call came while he was still talking. Then the third. Phones vibrated across the table like insects. Blake ignored them. He hated interruptions. He hated being rushed. He believed urgency was a tactic used by people without leverage. Linda finally looked at him. Really looked at him. And for the first time didn't try to manage her expression. Her face had gone pale. Not frightened. Calculating. Like someone watching a door close forever. "Blake," she said quietly. "We should at least," he cut her off. "We're not making decisions based on hysteria." By the time he finished that sentence, the stock had dropped 20% in 20 minutes. No announcement had been made, no data released, nothing concrete had changed. Except perception. Except trust. Except the growing certainty that the problem wasn't a project or a forecast. It was judgment. Screens across the floor updated in real time. Red numbers multiplied. Someone finally said the number out loud. Blake stopped smiling. That was when denial shifted into panic. Not publicly, not yet, but internally, where no performance could hide it. I heard all of this later, secondhand, filtered through voices that sounded stunned. As for me, I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt confirmation. The system wasn't breaking. It was responding. And Blake had just ignored the last warning that still spoke softly. Silence was the only decision I made that day. And it was deliberate. I didn't tweet. I didn't post. I didn't send a clarifying email or a carefully worded message to anyone who might still listen. No explanations, no corrections, no defense. I let the space speak for itself, because I knew filling it would only dilute what was already happening. From the outside, my absence looked passive. From the inside, it was restraint pushed to its limit. Blake, on the other hand, couldn't stay quiet. He never could. As the numbers kept falling, his voice got louder, sharper, more erratic. According to people still inside, he paced the floor and snapped at screens as if they were misbehaving employees. "This market is stupid," he said. "They're panicking over nothing." Nothing was his favorite word. It excused everything. Someone mentioned governance again. Blake scoffed. "They don't understand how we operate," he said, waving a hand. "This will correct itself." It didn't. While I sat at home, phone face down on the table, Blake was busy assigning blame. Analysts were idiots. Investors were short-sighted. The press was irresponsible. At no point did he question the moment that started it all. At no point did he ask what his behavior had signaled to people trained to read signals for a living. That was the helpless part. Watching a man dig deeper into denial, convinced the hole would somehow turn into solid ground. Late in the afternoon, my phone buzzed. One message, then another, then a call I didn't answer. I knew what they wanted. A quote, a clarification, something to stabilize the narrative. But I had already learned that silence, when timed correctly, wasn't empty. It was weight, inside the company. Tension turned into paralysis. Departments waited for direction that didn't come. Meetings ended without conclusions. Linda Marsh stopped trying to spin. There was nothing left to polish. Then the board stepped in. The request was formal, immediate, unmistakable. An emergency report explaining the stock movement, the governance concerns, and the leadership response. It landed on Blake's desk like a verdict. "Have it ready by end of day," someone said over speakerphone. Blake opened his mouth, closed it, then said, "We'll get back to you." He didn't have an answer. Not a real one. Not one that explained why investors were reacting to conduct instead of numbers. Not one that justified a public loss of control. For the first time, his voice didn't fill the room. It stalled there, exposed. I heard about that moment later. How quiet it got. How no one rushed to help. Silence had finally crossed the table. And this time, it wasn't on my side. You might think everything is settled, but the story hasn't had its final say. The shift happened quietly, the way serious things usually do. There was no announcement, no raised voices, no dramatic interruption, just a subtle change in posture when Marcus Bell walked into the room. People straightened. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Screens were minimized without being told. Marcus was the company's senior legal advisor, the one they called when optimism ran out. He didn't smile. He never did. He placed a thin folder on the table, adjusted his glasses, and spoke in a tone that carried no emotion and no mercy. "We need to address a governance failure." The word landed hard. Governance, not performance, not volatility. Governance was the accusation you couldn't outmaneuver. It implied structure, responsibility, leadership. It meant the problem wasn't temporary, and it wasn't external. Blake tried to respond. He cleared his throat and said something about market sentiment. Marcus didn't interrupt. He waited, then shook his head once. "This isn't about sentiment," he said. "It's about conduct." No one mentioned my name. No one needed to. Every person in that room knew exactly which moment had triggered this conversation. The thrown binder, the witnesses, the silence that followed. My absence sat there like an empty chair no one dared to point at. Blake shifted in his seat. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked small, not powerless, just exposed. The kind of exposure that comes when confidence loses its audience. Marcus continued, outlining risks with clinical precision: loss of investor trust, board liability, regulatory scrutiny. Each phrase stripped another layer of denial away. Linda Marsh stared at the table. Her hands were clenched so tightly, her knuckles had gone white. Someone asked if this could be managed internally. Marcus didn't answer right away. Then he said, That depends on what happens next. That was the moment fear settled in. Not panic, not chaos. Fear. Controlled and unmistakable. The kind that tells you the room is no longer yours. The update came shortly after. An email forwarded without commentary. No embellishment. No attempt to soften the blow. Ethan Wolfe had formally withdrawn his fund's position. No threats. No speeches. Just a decision. The impact was immediate. A collective inhale. Blake stared at the screen, reading the same sentence over and over, as if repetition might change its meaning. Ethan hadn't criticized. He hadn't demanded explanations. He had simply left. That was the most humiliating part, not the loss itself, but how cleanly it happened. I learned all of this later, piece by piece, through people who sounded embarrassed just telling it. I didn't feel triumph. I felt a quiet certainty. When governance fails, markets don't argue, they exit. And once they do, there is no apology that brings them back. Desperation arrived, wearing the costume of reason. That was how Blake tried to sell it. Anyway, after the panic calls, after the board warnings, after Ethan Wolfe walked away without looking back, Blake decided it was time to explain himself, not to listen, not to reflect, to explain. He drafted statements, revised them, asked for talking points. He wanted language that sounded accountable without admitting fault, strong without apologizing, calm without conceding anything. The goal was simple: restore confidence before the market closed again. Linda Marsh stood beside him, silent. She had already learned what Blake still refused to accept. Investors didn't want reassurance. They wanted evidence of control, and that evidence no longer existed. Blake insisted on a call. "If they hear me," he said, "they'll understand." He practiced his tone, softened his delivery, even tried humility. It didn't come naturally. He sounded like someone reading an unfamiliar script. The statement went out just before noon, carefully worded, legally safe, emotionally hollow. It blamed misunderstanding, timing, and market sensitivity. It avoided the moment everyone was actually reacting to. The market answered anyway. The line dropped again. This time without hesitation. 20% had felt violent. This felt surgical. Traders weren't panicking anymore. They were exiting, one by one, methodically. The kind of movement that doesn't reverse because it isn't emotional. Blake watched the screen as if proximity might change the outcome. He said, "This isn't fair. To no one in particular." Then he said, "They didn't even give us a chance." That was the point. Markets don't debate. They decide. They don't listen for sincerity. They measure stability. An apology is a human gesture. A market is not human. Phones rang unanswered. Messages piled up. Blake stopped pacing and sat down heavily, elbows on the table, hands clasped like prayer. No one joined him. There was nothing left to say. By mid-afternoon, the number was unavoidable, 60% down. The room went quiet in a way I hadn't heard before. Not tense. Empty. Like something had already ended. And everyone was just standing inside the remains. I wasn't there to witness it, but I could imagine it clearly. Blake staring at the wreckage of his own words. Linda finally looking away, screens glowing red, indifferent to explanation. I closed my laptop when I saw the number. Not out of satisfaction, out of finality. The market had spoken in the only language it uses, and it had said enough. You can't apologize to a market. You can only lose it. And once that trust is gone, no performance, promise, or personality ever rebuilds it fast enough for markets today. The invitation arrived without ceremony, a short message forwarded by someone from legal. It didn't ask me to return to work, didn't mention reinstatement, and didn't pretend anything could be repaired. They wanted my perspective. That word always appears when decisions have already been made. I read it once and set the phone down. I knew what they were hoping for. A calming voice, a technical explanation, something they could quote without owning. I also knew what would happen if I walked back into that building. Silence would turn into usefulness again, and usefulness would be mistaken for consent. So I declined. I wrote a single sentence, polite and final. I said I had nothing to add beyond what the market had already absorbed. Then I closed my email and went back to my day. It felt cleaner that way, inside the company. The meeting happened anyway, not an exit interview, not officially, just a closed-door session with the board, legal counsel, and one empty chair no one referenced. My absence did more than my presence ever could. Blake spoke first. I was told his voice was steady, practiced, almost convincing. He framed the collapse as a misunderstanding, a convergence of bad timing and external fear. He avoided details. He avoided accountability. He avoided the moment that mattered. The board listened. Then they asked questions. Why had an investor witnessed a public outburst? Why had governance risk been triggered by conduct instead of data? Why had leadership escalated instead of stabilized? Each question narrowed the space Blake had left himself. At some point, Marcus Bell interrupted, not sharply, just enough to shift the tone. He reminded the room that confidence is not cosmetic, that markets don't separate behavior from leadership, that perception, once fractured, becomes liability. Blake argued. He blamed pressure. He blamed misinterpretation. He even blamed me, indirectly, by questioning whether my work had framed risk too aggressively. No one defended him. No one needed to. The decision was made quickly after that. Not dramatic. Not cruel. Procedural. Blake Harrington was asked to resign. I learned about it hours later. Through a message that contained no emotion and no commentary. Just a fact. The kind that doesn't invite reaction. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel relief. What I felt was colder than satisfaction. The system had corrected itself without my involvement. No speeches, no confrontation, just consequence. That is what justice looks like in institutions that survive. Quiet, irreversible, and entirely indifferent to how loudly someone once spoke. It settled in slowly, leaving nothing dramatic behind. Only structure restored and lessons that no executive meeting could erase again afterward. I started my new job on a Monday that felt almost ordinary, which was exactly what I wanted. A smaller firm, fewer titles, clear lines of responsibility, no grand speeches about vision, just people who valued preparation and understood that stability wasn't boring, it was earned. I wasn't introduced as a savior or a risk expert, just Reagan. That was enough. The news followed me anyway. Blake Harrington's name disappeared quietly. No announcement, no farewell email. One day, his profile still sat on leadership pages, quoted in old interviews and archived press releases. The next, it didn't. Search results changed. Panels confirmed new interim leadership. History adjusted itself with professional efficiency. No one talked about the meeting where my project hit the floor. That moment never became a headline. It didn't need to. Everyone remembered what followed instead. The charts, the withdrawals, the sudden concern over governance and conduct. Institutions don't dwell on scenes. They remember outcomes. From time to time, someone reached out, former colleagues, a few board-connected acquaintances. They never asked how I felt. They asked what I had seen coming. That question always came too late. I told them the truth. Trimmed of drama, the work hadn't failed. The system had worked exactly as designed. Signals were sent, interpreted, acted upon. Nothing supernatural, nothing personal, just consequences moving faster than excuses. In my new office, I pinned nothing on the walls. No awards, no reminders. I preferred the clean space. It made thinking easier. Sometimes I caught myself smiling, not out of triumph, but recognition. There was comfort in knowing I hadn't needed to raise my voice or defend my worth. The absence of noise had done more than any argument ever could. The market moved on. It always does. New leadership stabilized things. New language replaced old mistakes. But one lesson lingered beneath the recovery numbers, even if no one said it aloud. In the end, the market didn't care about my project. It cared about who threw it away. That was the story the numbers told. And once you learn how to read that language, you never mistake volume for authority again. When I look back, The lesson isn't about winning or watching someone fall. It's about quiet discipline. Real strength doesn't argue when it's mocked, and it doesn't panic when it's ignored. Systems remember what people try to bury, and markets reward steadiness long after noise fades. As you listen to this story, how did it make you feel? Which moment stayed with you the longest? The insult, the silence, or the consequence? And where are you listening from right now? If this story resonated, leave a comment, give it a like, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe. We're just getting started.